This video is about solving quadratics using square roots. Now this works when there is no middle term, meaning there is only an x squared and a constant. So in terms of our ax squared plus bx plus c, we can have an ax squared, we can have a c, but there is no just x term. So example one, for all of these, our goal is going to be to isolate the x squared and then square root both sides. So for the first one, we have 2x squared equals 8. Well, I want to get that x squared by itself first. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. That's going to give me x squared equals 4. And now to get x by itself, I can square root the x squared to give me x, which means I must therefore square root the 4. But you have to remember that when you have square roots that there are actually two answers. So for this, our answer is going to be both positive and negative 2. Now, when we were doing square roots in the beginning of the year, I did say that that plus or minus sign had to be there in order for you to say plus or minus 2. But this is a little bit different because we're using square roots to actually solve this equation. So we're going to make a note that when using square roots to solve equations, you must include both the positive and the negative. Okay, for the second one, we have m squared minus 18 equals negative 18. So in here, we have to get rid of this constant of negative 18, okay? So we're going to add 18 to both sides, which gives us m squared equals 0. So we're going to square root both sides. We get m equals, and in this case, there is no positive or negative 0, so our answer is just m equals 0. And for c, we have b squared plus 12 equals 5. Let's get that b squared alone and subtract 12 from both sides. And b squared equals negative 7. We then square root the b squared and square root the negative 7. And hopefully we realize what's going on here. We cannot take the square root of a negative. No number times itself is going to give you negative 7. So in this case, the answer is no solution because you can't square root a negative. Okay, so for the first one, it was square root of 4 as a positive number. That gave us the positive and negative 2. For the second one, when it was m squared equals 0, that was just m equals 0. And the last one, when we tried to square root that negative, it meant no solution. Example 2 is dealing with fractions. Okay, and this one actually works out pretty well. I put some in parentheses because it's not going to work for every fraction. And in those cases, you'll just have to kind of use your calculator at times. But for this one, we're going to get that x squared alone by dividing both sides by 4. And I don't know why my pen is working sporadically. There we go. So we get x squared equals, and I don't want to actually divide 9 divided by 4 right now. And the reason being, okay, is that 9 and 4 are both perfect squares. So I'm going to leave that 9 over 4 as it is, so that now when I square root both sides, I can get x equals positive and negative, and we're going to take the square root of both numbers. So our answer must be positive and negative 3 over 2. Now that will only work out nicely if both of our numbers are perfect squares. And if they're not perfect squares, then you'll just have to, simplify, evaluate with a calculator, leave it as is, which I'll get into in the next example. But when they are perfect squares, you really want to keep it exact and just kind of keep it as that fraction. Okay, and example 3, when it doesn't work out so nicely, which happens a lot. So here we have a coefficient and a constant. So we're going to get rid of that constant first. We get negative 3x squared equals negative 24. And then we can divide both sides by negative 3. We get x squared equals 8. So now to get x, we square root both sides. And that one is not a perfect square, so it does not work out so nicely. So we have a couple options here, and it really comes down to what the directions in each question tell you to do. So for this one, we could just leave it as positive or negative root 8. Okay, that is one way of writing our answer. You might be asked to simplify. Okay, we did this at the beginning of the year. Root 8, I can split that up into root 4 and root 2. And I like using 4 because that is a perfect square, and I can take the square root of 4. So we can also say that x is positive or negative 2 root 2. That is also an option. Or the directions might just tell you to round. So you bust out the calculator, okay, you type in your square roots of 8, and you would figure out that x equals positive or negative, I just did to the 100th, so positive or negative 2.83. So once again, if it doesn't work out nicely, make sure you're looking to see what the directions are asking you to do. It might just say, leave it as is with the radical. It might ask you to simplify the radical, or it might ask you to round it to the nearest tenth, hundredth, thousandth, etc. Okay, our last type of question looks a little bit different than the ones above, because it's not just x squared here. We have something in parentheses with the x, and then that is squared. But we're still going to use this idea of square rooting both sides. So we're going to isolate the parentheses, square root both sides, and then isolate the x. So we're kind of isolating twice here. So here, there is nothing else with the parentheses. So for a, we can just start by square rooting both sides. Okay, square rooting the square undoes it. So really all we're left with on the left is x minus 3. And on the right, we're going to have positive negative square root of this, so positive or negative 3. Now the x is out of that parenthesis with the square, so we can add 3 here to get x alone. And then what's really going to happen here is this is going to give us 2 different answers. So it's kind of like we have to do this little tiny mini question twice. Okay, we can have the positive 3, and I'm going to put the little positive there because we don't really need it, but we can do the positive 3 plus 3, which would give us 6. Okay, or we can do x equals negative 3 plus 3, which means x is 0. So both of those are solutions to this equation. And can you always plug it back in and check? 6 minus 3 is 3, 3 squared is 9. 0 minus 3 is negative 3, negative 3 squared is also 9. So both of these answers do make sense. For the next one, the parentheses is not alone, so we must start by dividing both sides by 2. So we get x minus 2 squared equals 9. Now we can square root both sides. It's going to look kind of similar to the last one, but we have x minus 2 instead of x minus 3 equals positive or negative 3. We can add 2 to both sides, and then we split it up into the 2 pieces. So we can have x equal to positive 3 plus 2, which means x is 5, or x equals negative 3 plus 2, which is x equals negative 1. And last example, we got to divide both sides by 2 to get x minus 4 squared equals 20. Now we can square root both sides. So we get x minus 4, and this one does not work out to be a nice number. So for now, let's just keep it as positive or negative root 20. And then we can add 4 to both sides. And we can say x equals, now this one's a little bit harder to write. when you have something like this and you have like a positive or negative root, it's customary to write that constant first. So positive 4 plus or minus root 20. Okay, that would be one way of writing that. Or we're going to kind of do what we did above. Directions might say to simplify. So root 20 would be root 4 times root 5, which would be 2 root 5. So we can simplify the radical, and we can also say x equals 4 plus or minus 2 root 5. That's an option. Okay, or if we round, root 20 is approximately 4.47. So we would have to do, I'm going to write it in my blue, the positive 4 plus the 4.47, or the negative 4 plus the 4.47, which would give us x equals 8.47 or 0.47. So those are 3 different ways of writing that answer. And once again, you'd have to look to see how the directions tell you to do it.